The morning mist clung to the mountainside like regret, refusing to dissipate. Lorelei Ashford stood on what remained of the front porch, weathered hands wrapped around a cup of instant coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. At 45, she felt every year carved into her bones, each one a testament to the long nights at the consulting firm, the divorce that had drained her savings and spirit in equal measure, the gradual realization that the life she had built in Charlotte bore no resemblance to anything she had once wanted. The cabin behind her groaned in the morning breeze, a symphony of settling wood and rusted hinges that spoke of decades without care. Paint peeled from the siding in long strips, exposing gray wood beneath. The front steps sagged under even her weight, and she was not a large woman. Vines had claimed the eastern wall entirely, their tendrils creeping through broken windows and gaps in the foundation, like nature's slow verdict on human ambition. This had been her grandfather's pride once. She remembered that much from childhood visits back when the world seemed simpler and adults knew all the answers. Now it looked like defeat made tangible. It was early July, the mountain summer just beginning to show its intensity. She had driven up exactly 3 days ago, leaving behind the suffocating humidity of the Piedmont for this cooler elevation. A small voice broke through her thoughts. Brennan appeared in the doorway, 8 years old, and still carrying the careful wariness the divorce had etched into him. His dark hair stuck up at odd angles, and he wore the same Ninja Turtle shirt he had insisted on packing despite her protests. The words came out quiet, almost apologetic. "Mom, do we really have to stay here?" She turned to look at him. This boy who deserved so much better than a mother scrambling to reinvent herself before the savings ran out entirely. The question hung between them unanswered because what could she say that would make sense to a child, that they had nowhere else to go, that his father had already moved on to a gleaming apartment complex with amenities she could never afford, that this rotting cabin was literally their last option. They had driven up from Charlotte on Monday, her Honda loaded with sleeping bags, canned goods, and a stubborn determination to understand what her grandfather Silas had meant. The envelope had arrived 2 weeks after his funeral, yellowed with age, sealed with red wax that bore the impression of a small hammer crossed with what looked like a chisel. Inside, his careful script had spelled out instructions that made little sense at the time. She pulled the letter from her jacket pocket, now unfolding it for the dozenth time. The paper was soft with handling, and his handwriting had the careful deliberation of someone who chose words with purpose. Lorelei, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are probably standing in what looks like a wreck. Do not let appearances fool you. This old place has kept more secrets than the mountains themselves. I know we lost touch these past years. Your grandmother always said you had too much of the world in you to be content with mountain ways. Maybe she was right. But blood calls to blood, and there is something here that belongs to you now. Look beneath what others see. The real treasure was always hidden from plain sight. You will find the first key behind the loose stone in the garden wall. Third one from the southeast corner. What it opens will surprise you. What you do with what you find is up to you. But I hope you will understand why I kept it safe all these years. The workshop has been waiting for the right hands to bring it back to life. I believe those hands might be yours. The postscript felt like a whisper from beyond. Do not let the townspeople discourage you. They mean well, but they have forgotten what we Ashfords are capable of when we put our minds to something. Workshop. The word had puzzled her from the first reading. She had vague memories of Silas whittling small animals from pieces of oak and maple, his hands sure and steady as they coaxed rabbits and deer from raw wood. But a workshop worth hiding, worth protecting with cryptic instructions and sealed letters. The key he mentioned was still in her pocket, a small brass thing worn smooth with age. She had found it exactly where he said, under the third stone from the southeast corner of what used to be a garden wall. But so far she had discovered nothing it might open. The doors she tried yielded to force rather than keys, and the few cabinets she managed to pry open contained nothing but old dishes and moth-eaten linens. Brennan moved beside her, his small hand slipping into hers. The touch still surprised her sometimes, how perfectly their hands fit together, how much strength she drew from this connection. She squeezed gently, trying to transmit reassurance she did not feel. The townspeople she had encountered at the gas station yesterday had looked at her with a mixture of pity and amusement when she asked for directions. The station owner, a weathered man in his 60s with graying hair and hands that looked capable of fixing most anything, had studied her face with recognition. His voice had carried the directness mountain people were known for. "You're Silas's granddaughter. Heard he passed. Sorry for your loss." Then, without pause, he had added what everyone seemed to be thinking. "Hope you're not planning on trying to live up there. That place has been falling down for 20 years. Be cheaper to buy a tent." Similar conversations had followed at the hardware store and the small grocery market. Everyone remembered Silas Ashford, but their memories were tinged with the same gentle condescension she had grown accustomed to in her corporate life. He had been a character, they said, kept to himself mostly, had some kind of workshop back there, but nobody knew what he made anymore. An old-fashioned fellow, the librarian had explained, always tinkering with wood and such, never saw much come of it, though. Now, standing in the ruins of his world, Lorelei wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The practical part of her mind, the voice that had guided her through 15 years of financial analysis and strategic planning, whispered that she should cut her losses, sell the land for whatever it would bring, pay off the rest of the divorce debts, find a reasonable apartment back in Charlotte, start over with what little remained of her savings and her bruised confidence. But something about the morning light filtering through the broken shutters reminded her of being 8 years old, Brennan's age, now sitting on this same porch while Silas whittled those small animals. His hands had been sure then, carving with a precision that had seemed magical to her young eyes. The memory stirred something she thought had died in the divorce proceedings and corporate downsizing, a sense of wonder of possibilities existing beyond spreadsheets and profit margins. Brennan tugged at her hand, his voice carrying the impatience of hunger. "Can we have breakfast now? I'm starving and this place is super creepy." He paused, then added with the careful tone children use when delivering difficult truths. "Dad says we could still move into his new apartment complex. They have a pool and everything." The sting of her ex-husband's offer hit harder than it should have. Another reminder of how quickly Sterling had moved on, how easily he had rebuilt while she was still sifting through the wreckage. The gleaming apartment complex with its amenities and conveniences stood in sharp contrast to this rotting cabin, and they both knew it. She forced brightness into her voice. "Let's see what we can find inside. Maybe it's not as bad as it looks." But it was exactly as bad as it looked. The main room stretched larger than it appeared from outside, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and built-in shelves lining another. A narrow staircase led up to what she assumed was a loft bedroom. Everything was covered in dust and debris, years of neglect made visible. But underneath the grime she could sense something solid. The walls were straight, the floor level despite its warped surface. Someone had built this place to last. Brennan made a face at the musty smell but set about exploring with the curiosity of childhood, poking at dusty shelves and peering into cobweb-filled corners. Lorelei pulled the letter from her pocket again, reading it in the dim light that struggled through dirty windows. The paper whispered against her fingertips as she traced the familiar words. "Look beneath what others see." What had Silas meant? What was she supposed to be looking for? A knock at the front door startled them both. Brennan ran to the window, his wariness of strangers heightened since the divorce. His voice came out uncertain. "It's some man. He looks old but not scary." Lorelei opened the door to find a man in his late 60s wearing work clothes and a cautious expression. He had the kind of weathered face that spoke of outdoor work and honest living, with graying hair pulled back in a short ponytail and hands that looked capable of fixing most anything. A faded baseball cap sat low on his forehead. His voice carried the slow cadence of someone who measured words carefully. "Morning, I'm Dalton Pierce. Run the plumbing business down the mountain. Heard Silas's granddaughter was up here. Thought maybe you could use some practical advice." His eyes took in the sagging porch and broken railings, then moved to Brennan with a friendly nod. "This must be your boy. He's got the Ashford eyes sharp, like they see more than most folks do." She extended her hand, and his grip was firm, calloused. "Lorelei Ashford. and I suspect I can use all the advice I can get." Dalton's smile was genuine even if concern flickered behind it. Silas was a good man, kept to himself mostly, but he was fair in his dealings. He gestured at the cabin's deteriorating facade. "This place, though, it's been going downhill for a long time. Foundation's probably compromised, roof needs replacing, and I'd be surprised if the well still works. You thinking about trying to make it livable?" The question hung heavy with implications. She could hear what he was not saying, the same warnings everyone else had offered. That this was a fool's errand, that she should cut her losses and move on. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "What would you do if it was yours?" Dalton was quiet for a moment, studying the cabin with an eye that understood construction in ways she never would. "Depends on what you're looking for. If you need the money, sell the land to someone who can afford to start over. But if you're looking for something else—" He paused, then shrugged. "Well, Silas always claimed this place had good bones. Might be worth finding out if he was right." Before she could respond, he added something that felt like a warning. "Thing is, you should know there's been interest in this property for years. Fellow named Garrett Blackwell owns the development company down in Asheville. He's made offers before, generous ones, but Silas always turned him down. Now that your grandfather's passed—" He left the thought unfinished, but the implication was clear. Blackwell would come calling, and soon. Dalton promised to stop by again in a few days to check on their progress, then headed back to his truck. Lorelei found herself really looking at the cabin for the first time, not at its decay and damage, but at the underlying structure Silas had built. The logs were oak, she realized, fitted together with precision that spoke of real craftsmanship. The foundation stones were massive and carefully placed. Even the damage seemed mostly superficial neglect rather than structural failure. She spent the rest of the morning exploring, making mental notes of what needed immediate attention and what could wait. The well did work, producing clear, cold water that tasted of mountain springs. The electrical system was ancient but functional. Most importantly, the roof, while it leaked in several places, was not beyond repair. By afternoon, she was feeling cautiously optimistic. This was not the impossible task she had feared. It was just a very large, very challenging project, the kind of problem she had built her consulting career on solving. Only this time, the solution mattered in a way that quarterly profits never had. The brass key in her pocket seemed to grow heavier as the day wore on, a constant reminder that she still had not found what Silas had hidden. She had looked behind every obvious panel, checked every cabinet and closet, even examined the floorboards for signs of a concealed compartment. Whatever her grandfather had wanted her to find, he had hidden it well. Brennan's excited voice carried from across the room, breaking her concentration. "Mom! Mom, come quick, I found something weird." He was kneeling by the stone fireplace, his hands black with soot. The boy had discovered something that had escaped her initial inspection, a stone about knee-high on the left side that seemed slightly different from the others. It sat at an odd angle, and when she pressed against it, the stone shifted under pressure. She worked her fingers around its edges, and with a grinding sound of stone against stone, it moved inward, revealing a small cavity behind. Inside, her fingers found a folded piece of paper and something else, something smooth and carved. The paper was another note in Silas's handwriting, the ink faded but still legible. "The first step is always the hardest, but you have taken it. What you hold now opened doors for 3 generations of Ashfords. Use it well." The carved object made her gasp when she pulled it into the light. It was no bigger than her palm, but every surface was covered in intricate inlay work. Tiny pieces of different woods fitted together to create a pattern of leaves and vines so detailed and beautiful that it seemed to move in the morning light. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the kind of work she had only seen in museums or the homes of the very wealthy. Holding that small masterpiece, Lorelei understood why Silas had been so careful to hide his work. This was not the hobby craft of an old mountain man. This was art of the highest caliber, work that belonged in galleries and private collections. Work that represented not just skill, but a tradition of excellence that had somehow survived in this forgotten corner of the mountains. The brass key in her pocket suddenly felt warm against her fingers, and she knew with certainty that tomorrow she would find what it opened. And when she did, her life would change in ways she could not yet imagine. But first, she needed to deal with more immediate concerns: food, shelter, and the growing awareness that Brennan was watching her with a mixture of hope and fear, waiting to see if his mother would give up or fight. She knelt beside him, holding the carved piece so he could see it properly. "Your great-great-grandfather made this, and your great-grandfather learned from him. This has been in our family for almost 100 years. Brennan touched it carefully, his small fingers tracing the intricate patterns. "Did Grandpa Silas make things like this?" The question opened something in her chest. "I think so. I think he made beautiful things that nobody knew about, and I think he wanted us to find them." That night, after Brennan had fallen asleep in his sleeping bag on the dusty floor, Lorelei sat by the fireplace and examined the carved piece again. In the flickering light of the camp lantern, she could see details she had missed before. The way different woods had been chosen not just for color, but for grain, creating subtle textures that enhanced the design. The precision of the cuts, measured in thousandths of an inch. The understanding of how wood moved and aged, ensuring the piece would survive for generations. This was not just craftsmanship, it was artistry combined with engineering beauty, married to durability. And Silas had hidden it all away, protecting it from a world that no longer valued such things. She thought about the letter, about his hope that she would understand why he kept it safe. The answer was becoming clear. In a world that valued speed over quality, efficiency over beauty, mass production over individual craftsmanship, what Silas had preserved was revolutionary simply by existing. The next morning brought a vehicle rumbling up the rough mountain road. Lorelei recognized the sound of expensive engineering even before the black SUV came into view. It pulled to a stop near the cabin, and a man emerged wearing a suit that probably cost more than her last month's rent had been. He was late 50s, she estimated, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way. His smile was practiced, professional, and utterly cold. The introduction came smooth as oil. "Ms. Ashford, I'm Garrett Blackwell, Highlands Development Group. I heard you had inherited the old Ashford place. Thought I would stop by and introduce myself." His eyes swept over the cabin, assessing, calculating. "I specialize in helping property owners realize the full value of their assets. This area is becoming quite desirable for vacation homes, and your parcel, while it needs some work, has excellent potential." The offer came quickly, barely masked as courtesy. "I would be interested in making you a fair proposal. Something appropriate given the condition of the existing structure, but enough to let you start fresh, somewhere more suitable." She felt the weight of the carved piece in her pocket, thought of the workshop Silas had mentioned, the secrets he had protected. This man wanted to tear it all down, replace it with vacation homes for wealthy outsiders who would visit a few weeks a year. Her voice came out cooler than she intended. "I'm not interested in selling, Mr. Blackwell." His smile did not falter, but something in his eyes hardened. "I understand this is a lot to consider. Why don't I leave my card? When you have had time to think about the realities of bringing this place up to code, perhaps after speaking with the county planning office you might feel differently." The threat was barely veiled. He knew something she did not have: leverage he was preparing to use. From inside the cabin came the sound of Brennan running down the stairs. Her son burst onto the porch, excitement overriding his usual caution around strangers. "Mom, I found something else. There's a loose board in the loft, and there are papers underneath." Blackwell's gaze sharpened at this. His attention suddenly focused on Brennan with an intensity that made Lorelei instinctively step between them. "You must be the young man of the house. Find anything interesting under those floorboards?" Before Brennan could answer, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "We're in the middle of some important work, Mr. Blackwell. If you would like to discuss the property further, you can call me." The dismissal was clear. Blackwell retreated to his vehicle with a final warning disguised as advice. "The county inspectors around here can be real sticklers, Ms. Ashford. Trying to renovate without the right permits can turn into a legal nightmare. Just something to consider." As the SUV disappeared down the mountain road, Lorelei felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Blackwell's visit had not been a courtesy call. It was reconnaissance, and the battle lines were being drawn. Brennan tugged at her sleeve, impatient with the adult conversation. "Mom, you didn't even look at what I found. It's really old papers with drawings and stuff." Inside, he led her to the loft bedroom and proudly pointed to a loose floorboard he had pried up. She knelt and reached into the space beneath, pulling out a stack of yellowed papers wrapped in oilcloth. When she unfolded them on the cabin's kitchen table, she found herself looking at commission records, detailed drawings, client names, payment information, and delivery dates for dozens of custom furniture pieces created by what the letterhead called the Ashford Workshop. The earliest ones dated from the 1930s, the most recent from the late 1960s. The payments recorded were substantial even by today's standards. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars for individual pieces at a time when such sums represented small fortunes. But what struck her most deeply were the personal notes Silas had written in the margins. Client-requested drawer for war letters, handled with appropriate reverence, used only local cherry throughout to support regional timber. These were not just business transactions. They were relationships built on mutual respect between craftsman and client, between someone who understood quality and someone who could create it. Silas had cared about the people who would live with his work, had considered their needs and stories in every design decision. The door opened without warning, and Dalton stepped inside carrying a toolbox and what looked like several bags of groceries. "Thought you might need some supplies, and maybe some help figuring out what's salvageable." He glanced past her to where Brennan sat at the table, still working on a small carving with one of Silas's simpler knives. "I see you have got a woodworker in training already." His eyes fell on the commission records spread across the table, and his expression shifted from friendly concern to something approaching awe. "Is that what I think it is? The old Ashford ledgers?" She nodded, watching him examine the papers with careful hands. He studied the drawings, the careful notations, the evidence of a business that had once thrived in these mountains. His voice came out quiet, respectful. "My father did some business with Silas back in the day. Custom pieces for some of the wealthy folks who had summer places up here. Dad always said Silas's work was museum quality, the kind of craftsmanship you don't see anymore." He paused, looking at her directly. "Of course, that was a long time ago. Most folks nowadays have forgotten what that kind of work looked like." The comment hung in the air, and Lorelei felt the weight of what she was beginning to understand. Her grandfather had not been just a mountain hermit tinkering with wood. He had been the last keeper of a family tradition that stretched back 4 generations, a master craftsman whose work had graced some of the finest homes in the region. And he had died believing that tradition would die with him. Dalton cleared his throat, seeming to make a decision. "There's someone you should probably meet. My nephew Everett is studying furniture design at the community college over in Buncombe. He's been looking for someone who knows the old ways, the traditional techniques they can't really teach in school anymore." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts. "Might be we can help each other out. You need someone with construction knowledge to help with the cabin. Everett needs someone who can teach him what they are not learning in class. And Silas, well, I suspect he would have wanted the knowledge to keep going." The offer was more than practical assistance. It was validation that what she was attempting mattered, that the traditions Silas had protected were worth preserving. That afternoon, a young man arrived in a beat-up pickup truck. Everett Pierce was 23, tall and lanky, with the careful movements of someone accustomed to working with precision tools. His hands bore the calluses and small scars of a woodworker despite his youth. When she showed him the carved piece from the fireplace, his sharp intake of breath echoed in the quiet cabin. "Is it really true Mr. Ashford had a complete traditional workshop, no power tools at all?" His voice held reverence typically reserved for sacred spaces. "We study historical techniques in school, but most of it is theoretical. Nobody actually works that way anymore." Lorelei led them to the built-in shelves along the eastern wall, running her hands along the back panel. She had been examining it all morning, convinced there was something more here than met the eye. One section of shelving about 3 feet wide seemed shallower than the rest. The back wall behind it was only 6 inches deep, while the adjacent sections went back nearly a foot. Her fingers traced the edges until she felt it a subtle outline of a rectangular seam. When she pressed against the panel, it moved slightly inward. She ran her hands along the surface, searching until she found what she was looking for. A small concealed keyhole positioned at shoulder height. The brass key slid in perfectly. When she turned it, she heard the soft click of a mechanism engaging, and the entire back panel swung inward on well-oiled hinges. The space beyond took her breath away. She was looking into a workshop that time had preserved in perfect detail. Workbenches lined the walls, their surfaces worn smooth by decades of use. Hand tools hung in precise arrangements on wooden pegboards, chisels, planes, carving knives, and instruments she could not even name. Wood samples were organized in careful rows, each piece labeled in Silas's meticulous script, and in the center of the room stood a masterpiece of workmanship, a cabinet of drawers so beautiful it seemed to glow in the dim light filtering through a small curtained window. But it was not just the beauty of the space that stunned her. It was the evidence of recent use. The tools were clean and sharp, the workbenches clear of dust. Someone had been caring for this workshop, maintaining it with the devotion of a shrine keeper. Silas had been using this space until very recently, perhaps, until the illness that eventually claimed him. Brennan whispered beside her, his voice hushed with awe. "This is like a secret lair for making awesome stuff." Everett stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes cataloging each tool, each technique sample, each evidence of mastery that most people would never see. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled slightly. "Some of these planes, they don't even make these anymore. And this joinery, this is pure skill and patience. You can't achieve this with machines." On the main workbench, Lorelei found a project in progress, a jewelry box carved from a single piece of cherry wood, its surfaces partially completed with inlay work that matched the samples she had discovered. Beside it lay a set of plans drawn in Silas's careful hand, showing every detail of the design down to the smallest decorative element. A sheet of paper tucked under the corner of the plans caught her attention. Another note from her grandfather. This one dated just 2 months before his death. "Lorelei, if you found this room, then you understand what I was trying to preserve. This workshop has been my life's work, but it was never meant for just one person. 3 generations of Ashfords learned their craft here, and now it waits for the 4th. I do not know if you have the patience for this kind of work, or the temperament. Learning to listen to wood, understanding what it wants to become, is not easy. But if you are willing to try, everything you need is here. The tools, the techniques, the wood, even some of the old commission records if you want to understand what this business once was. The choice is yours, granddaughter. You can seal this room back up and sell the land and no one would blame you. Or you can take up the tools and see what your hands might create. Either way, you will have my blessing. But if you choose the workshop, remember this. What we make here is not just furniture or decoration. It is legacy, made tangible, tradition given form. In a world that seems to value speed over beauty, maybe that still matters." The tools were waiting, he had written. The same tools that had shaped 3 generations of Ashford craftsmen, now silent and patient in their careful arrangements. Standing in that hidden workshop, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of generations, Lorelei felt something shift deep inside her chest. The corporate executive who had driven up the mountain 3 days ago, cynical and burned out, ready to cut her losses, seemed like a stranger now. In her place stood someone she barely recognized, but somehow remembered, a young girl who had once watched her grandfather's hands transform raw wood into wonder. She picked up one of the carving knives, testing its weight and balance. The handle fit her palm as if it had been made for her, worn smooth by hands that shared her blood and her heritage. For the first time since the divorce, since the layoff, since all the small defeats that had brought her to this mountain, Lorelei Ashford knew this was her fight to take. Brennan moved beside her, his small hand slipping into hers, and she understood that whatever came next, whatever challenges Blackwell and the world threw at them, she would not face them alone. The workshop had waited nearly a century for the 4th generation. Now it would witness what those hands could learn to create. Everett returned the following morning with a notebook and a reverence that made him seem younger than 23. He moved through the workshop like someone entering a cathedral, touching nothing without permission, his eyes cataloging techniques most people his age had only read about in textbooks. The first lesson began with failure. Lorelei attempted a simple dovetail joint under his guidance, her hands clumsy with the unfamiliar tools. The corporate precision that had served her well in spreadsheets translated poorly to wood. Her first cut wandered from the pencil line like a drunk navigating ice. The second split the grain entirely. Frustration boiled up, the kind that had driven her success in business, but now threatened to derail this entirely different path. She wanted to discard the ruined piece, start fresh, push through until she achieved perfection. Everett's voice cut through her mounting irritation. Patience doesn't come easily to people like us. We're used to immediate results, measurable progress. But wood doesn't care about our schedules or our expectations. It's been growing for decades, sometimes centuries. It has all the time in the world. The words sank in slowly, fighting against 15 years of corporate conditioning. She set down the chisel, studying the botched joint instead of hiding it. The wood had split because she forced the tool, pushed too hard, refused to listen to what the grain was telling her. Brennan watched from his corner, working on a small pine box with uneven edges but carefully executed corners. His natural dexterity surpassed hers in some aspects, his small fingers adapting to detail work with the ease of youth. There were moments when she caught him handling the tools with an intuitive understanding that made her chest tight with something between pride and grief for the grandfather he had never really known. The days fell into a rhythm. Mornings devoted to cabin repairs with Dalton's help, assessing structural damage and planning the massive renovation that loomed ahead. Afternoons split between workshop training and crafting simple items that Everett suggested might sell at regional craft markets, cutting boards, serving trays, small boxes. Nothing artistic yet, just fundamentals, building muscle memory and understanding. Evenings found her alone in the workshop after Brennan had fallen asleep practicing cuts by lantern light, her hands slowly learning what her mind already understood about precision and attention to detail. 3 weeks passed this way. The calendar had turned from early July into late July, and the mountain summer showed its true character, thunderstorms in the afternoon's heat that broke suddenly into cool evenings. The county vehicle appeared on a Thursday morning, its official seal gleaming in the summer sun. Lorelei had been expecting this visit ever since Blackwell's thinly veiled threats, but the timing still caught her off guard. Wallace Crane emerged from the passenger seat, a man in his early 60s wearing an expensive suit that seemed designed to emphasize his authority. 2 younger inspectors followed, carrying clipboards and wearing expressions of bureaucratic detachment. Crane's voice dripped with false courtesy. "Ms. Ashford, I'm Wallace Crane from the County Planning Office. These gentlemen are from the Building Inspection Department. We've had reports about someone attempting to occupy this structure. I'm afraid there are some serious safety concerns we need to address." She stepped onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind her to keep them from seeing inside. "Good morning, Mr. Crane. I wasn't expecting an inspection this early in my renovation process." His smile was professional, but cold, the kind she had seen across too many conference tables in her corporate life. "Well, that's part of the problem, Miss Ashford. You can't legally occupy a structure that hasn't passed basic safety inspections. And frankly, just looking at this place from the outside, I can see multiple code violations." He consulted his clipboard with theatrical precision. "Unsafe porch railings, damaged roof, probable foundation issues. We're going to have to red tag this property." One of the younger inspectors clarified with the careful neutrality of someone delivering bad news. "Red tagged means condemned for human habitation. You'll need to vacate immediately and bring everything up to current building codes before anyone can live here again." The words hit like a physical blow. She had been here less than a month, had finally started to see a path forward, and now the bureaucracy was moving to shut her down entirely. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "How long would that process take?" Crane consulted his clipboard again, though she suspected he already knew the answer. "Current building codes for mountain construction. You're looking at 6 months minimum, assuming you can afford the necessary work. More likely a year or more, and that's if the structure is even worth saving." He let his doubt hang in the air, then handed her a thick packet of papers. "These are the forms you'll need to start the process. I'd recommend consulting with a contractor who specializes in historic renovation, assuming you want to proceed. The packet was intimidating pages of regulations and requirements, estimated costs that made her savings account look pathetic, and timelines that stretched far beyond what she had imagined. The practical voice in her head grew louder, pointing out that this was exactly the kind of bureaucratic nightmare she had moved to the mountains to escape. But then she thought about the workshop hidden behind the false wall, about Silas's tools, waiting for hands willing to learn their secrets, about Brennan's growing confidence as he mastered skills most kids his age would never encounter. She met Crane's gaze without flinching. "I'll review these requirements with my attorney. Thank you for bringing them to my attention." His smile tightened at the mention of legal counsel, a crack in the bureaucratic facade. "Just doing my job, Ms. Ashford, ensuring county regulations are properly enforced." He paused before climbing back into the vehicle, delivering what felt like a scripted line. "I understand Garrett Blackwell has made you a very generous offer for the property. Might be worth considering before you invest too much in a challenging renovation." After they departed, Lorelei sat on the front steps and stared at the paperwork, her anger flaring at this transparent attempt to pressure her into selling. The strategy was obvious: delay until financial necessity forced her hand, make the path forward so difficult that Blackwell's offer looked reasonable by comparison. Brennan emerged from behind the cottage door where he had been listening, his perceptiveness cutting through adult pretense. "He wants us to give up, doesn't he? He's trying to make it so hard we'll just sell to that Blackwell guy." She pulled him close, struck again by how much the divorce had aged him beyond 8 years. "Yes, but we're not going to make it easy for them. Ashfords don't give up when things get difficult. We find another way." The words emerged with surprising conviction, and she realized somewhere in these weeks of struggling with hand planes and chisels, of learning to read wood grain and respect traditional methods, she had absorbed something fundamental that her corporate career never taught: the craftsman's commitment to seeing work through to completion, regardless of obstacles. That afternoon, with renovation work officially halted by Crane's order, Lorelei turned her full attention to organizing the workshop's storage cabinet. Her fingers found an envelope taped to the back panel, hidden behind wood-stained samples that had concealed it from casual inspection. The envelope was thick, official-looking, addressed to Silas Ashford in formal legal script. Inside were documents that made her sink onto the workshop's single chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. Property surveys, mineral rights assessments, water usage permits, all dated within the past 5 years, all bearing Silas's signature, all revealing a truth that changed everything she thought she knew about her inheritance. The Ashford property was not just 40 acres of mountain land with a run-down cabin. According to the surveys, Silas had owned nearly 200 acres stretching along 3 miles of mountain ridge, including mineral rights to a substantial copper deposit and exclusive access to one of the region's largest underground springs. The water rights alone, in an area increasingly concerned about development and conservation, were worth more than she had ever imagined. But the final document made her hands tremble as she read a formal appraisal commissioned just 6 months before Silas's death valued the complete property at $2.8 million. The cabin and immediate grounds that everyone had dismissed as worthless represented less than 10% of her actual inheritance. A handwritten note from Silas was clipped to the appraisal, his familiar script spelling out the truth he had kept hidden. "They have been circling like vultures for years, waiting for me to die so they can divide up the land and sell the water rights to developers. I've kept quiet about what we really own. Let them think it's just a worthless old cabin and a few acres of trees. But you need to know the truth. This land has supported 4 generations of Ashfords, and it could support 4 more if you're strong enough to hold on to it." Understanding crashed over her in waves. Crane's harassment over building permits the pressure from townspeople to sell and move on. The comments about being better off with something more practical, they had not been trying to help her. They had been trying to discourage her from staying, hoping she would give up and put the property on the market. Silas had been protecting more than just a family craft tradition. He had been safeguarding a legacy worth millions, and he had hidden that value so well that even she had not understood what she had inherited until now. The revelation was overwhelming. She could sell tomorrow and retire comfortably, never having to worry about money again, provide Brennan with every advantage Sterling's apartment complex could offer, and more. But she also understood why Silas had been so secretive. Development pressure in mountain communities was intense, driven by wealthy outsiders seeking retreat properties and local officials eager for the tax revenue that luxury developments would provide. If word got out about the true extent of her holdings, the pressure to sell would become crushing. The documents also explained something else that had puzzled her. Several entries in the business ledger mentioned clients who had become family friends, people who had visited the workshop regularly even after their commissions were complete. Looking at the names with new understanding, she realized these were not just customers. They were wealthy conservationists who shared Silas's commitment to preserving mountain traditions and natural resources. One name particularly caught her attention: Vivian Pemberton Beaumont, the Richmond woman who had commissioned a walnut secretary with secret compartments. According to a note in the ledger's margin, Mrs. Beaumont had visited the workshop multiple times over the years, not for additional commissions, but to document traditional craft techniques for the Smithsonian Institution's Folk Arts Archive. The phone number was still in Silas's address book, written in his careful hand. Lorelei's fingers trembled slightly as she dialed, unsure what to expect from a woman who might well be deceased after so many years. The voice that answered carried the cultured accent of old Virginia money and the sharp intelligence of someone who had spent her life championing important causes. "Silas's granddaughter. I wondered when I would hear from you. He spoke of you often, you know. Always hoped you would find your way back to the mountains eventually." The directness caught Lorelei off guard, as did the warmth in the stranger's voice. She explained her situation carefully, the discovery of the workshop, the pressure from Blackwell and Crane, her growing commitment to preserving Silas's craft legacy alongside the land itself. Vivian interrupted gently but firmly. "My dear, I assume you've discovered that you've inherited more than just a cabin and a craft workshop." The statement was not a question. Vivian knew about the property situation, had probably helped Silas research the mineral rights and water assessments years ago. Her next words confirmed it. "When development pressure started building in the area, Silas asked for my advice on how to protect what your family had built. I've been waiting for someone to call me ever since he passed." They arranged to meet the following week. Lorelei replaced the phone with a mixture of hope and trepidation. The pieces were beginning to align: Silas's cryptic warnings, Dalton's hints about resources, the ongoing pressure from Blackwell and his allies. She possessed something far more valuable than she had realized, something worth fighting for, beyond sentimental attachment to family traditions. That evening she showed Brennan a topographical map of the complete Ashford property that she had found among the documents. His small finger traced the property lines, his expression solemn with unexpected maturity. The question came out quiet, almost adult. "Is that why those men want us to leave? Because our land is worth a lot of money?" His perception startled her, the way he cut through complexity to reach the core truth. "Yes. How did you know?" He shrugged, the gesture simultaneously childlike and ancient. "Dad always said everything has a price. People only act nice when they want something from you." The bitterness in his voice revealed wounds from the divorce that she had underestimated. Sterling's influence, his transactional view of relationships, his emphasis on material value over emotional connection, had affected their son more deeply than she had realized. She chose her words carefully. "Not everything has a price, buddy. Some things are worth more than money. Like this land, like what we're learning in the workshop, like our family history. Those things matter in ways that can't be measured in dollars." As she spoke, Lorelei recognized the truth on a visceral level she had never accessed in her corporate life. The executive who had arrived on this mountain valuing everything in terms of profit and loss was transforming into someone who measured worth differently by durability, by beauty, by connection to something larger than individual gain. The next morning brought another visit to Cedar Creek, this time with a specific purpose. The small town's library occupied a stone building that looked like it had been constructed to outlast empires. Inside, the librarian was a woman in her late 70s with silver hair and bright, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She looked up from her desk with immediate recognition. You must be Lorelei. I'm Eleanor Hayes, but most folks call me by my maiden name, Vivian's cousin. She phoned to say you might be stopping by." The connection surprised Lorelei, though perhaps it should not have. In small mountain communities, the networks of relationship ran deeper than outsiders ever understood. Eleanor, or perhaps she should think of her as Vivian's local representative, led her to a small local history section and pulled out a thick, leather-bound volume. This is a collection of historical society articles from the 1960s. There's a wonderful piece about local craftspeople that features your great-grandfather. The article made Lorelei's heart race. There, in black and white photographs yellowed with age, were examples of Ashford workshop pieces that took her breath away. Dining room sets with inlay work so intricate it looked like jewelry. China cabinets that seemed to glow with inner light. Custom architectural elements. Mantelpieces, built-in bookcases, decorative panels that transformed ordinary rooms into showcases of artistry. According to the text, the Ashford Workshop was considered one of the finest custom furniture makers in the Southeast during its prime. They had clients from as far away as Atlanta and Richmond. The waiting list for a major piece was usually 6 months to a year. Eleanor's voice broke into her absorption. "What happened to it all?" "The business, I mean." The librarian's expression held genuine sadness. "Same thing that happened to a lot of traditional crafts, I suppose. Times changed. People started wanting furniture they could buy today instead of furniture they'd have to wait for. The mass-produced items got better and cheaper, and the market for handcrafted pieces just disappeared." She paused, then added something that felt significant. "It must have broken your grandfather's heart, but he never stopped believing in the value of what he did. Silas used to say that in a world that's forgotten how to wait for anything, the most revolutionary act is to create something that takes time, something that forces people to slow down and appreciate the process as much as the result." The comment resonated with everything Lorelei had been learning in the workshop, the way working with hand tools demanded a different relationship with time itself. You could not rush a dovetail joint or force a piece of inlay. The work took as long as it took, and fighting that reality only produced inferior results. That afternoon, Brennan accompanied her to the hardware store where the owner she had met on her first day greeted them with cautious friendliness. The boy had been exploring the town while she filed the official paperwork, challenging Crane's red tag order, and he had overheard something that changed the entire landscape of their struggle. He waited until they were back in the truck before speaking, his voice low and urgent. "Mom, I heard something important at the hardware store. Those guys didn't know I was listening." Lorelei had learned to trust her son's intelligence gathering. The divorce had made him observant in ways most 8-year-olds never needed to be. "What did you hear, buddy?" His eyes were serious, older than they should be. The hardware store owner was talking to another man about Mr. Blackwell. "They said he's planning to dam up the big creek that runs through our property to make a lake for his resort. And they're worried because that creek supplies water to lots of farms downstream." The information aligned perfectly with the water rights documentation she had discovered explaining why Blackwell coveted the Ashford property so intensely. A private lake would increase real estate values exponentially, while controlling the watershed would give him leverage over surrounding properties. Armed with this intelligence, Lorelei modified her approach entirely. Rather than seeking general support, she targeted specific community members whose livelihoods depended on the watershed: farmers, trout fishing guides, the owner of a small hydroelectric installation downstream. In each conversation, she emphasized her commitment to preserving natural water flow patterns and traditional land use. They might not care about woodworking techniques, but they understood the value of keeping the land undeveloped, of maintaining the ecological balance that their businesses and farms depended on. By day's end, she had assembled the beginning of a coalition people with personal stakes in preventing Blackwell's development plans, who recognized the Ashford property as the key to maintaining that balance. Vivian Beaumont arrived the following Tuesday in a Range Rover that navigated the mountain roads with practiced ease. Despite her 82 years, she moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. Her silver hair fell in an elegant bob that framed intelligent eyes that missed nothing as they surveyed the cabin and surrounding property. Her grandson Theodore accompanied her, a polished man in his mid-30s, with the appearance of someone comfortable in corporate boardrooms, but possessing the relaxed demeanor of old money that no longer needed to prove itself. He carried a leather portfolio and introduced himself as an environmental attorney specializing in conservation easements and historic preservation. Lorelei had spent the past 3 days preparing for this visit, cleaning the cabin, despite the renovation restrictions, organizing the workshop to highlight its historical significance, and completing enough of the jewelry box to demonstrate her developing skills. Vivian's first words carried the weight of someone who had been waiting for this moment. The craft tradition your grandfather maintained isn't just valuable on its own. Combined with the natural resources and undeveloped forest, this property represents something truly extraordinary, a complete ecosystem, both cultural and environmental, that could serve as a model for sustainable mountain community development. Theodore spread topographical maps and legal documents across the table, his presentation as polished as any corporate pitch she had ever heard. We can protect both the craft tradition and the land through conservation easements and historic designations. You maintain ownership while ensuring the property can never be inappropriately developed. The mineral rights and water access would provide income under strict environmental controls. Vivian leaned forward, her eyes bright with enthusiasm that made her seem decades younger. More importantly, you could establish this as a teaching center. Traditional craft workshops, environmental education, sustainable forestry practices. Several foundations would provide substantial funding for exactly this kind of program. The proposal was breathtaking in its scope and ambition. Instead of choosing between preserving Silas's legacy and securing her financial future, Lorelei could achieve both while creating something with far greater impact than she had imagined. The Ashford property could become a place where traditional mountain culture was not just preserved, but actively taught, where people could learn both craft techniques and environmental stewardship, where the past informed the future instead of being buried by it. But the proposal also meant accepting a level of public responsibility that intimidated her. She would no longer be a private individual learning a craft in solitude, but the steward of a significant cultural and environmental resource, with obligations to funders, students, and the broader community. Her doubt must have shown on her face because Vivian reached across the table and covered her hand with fingers that were surprisingly strong despite their age. "I'm not sure I'm qualified to lead something like this. I've only been practicing these techniques for a few weeks. I'm still a beginner myself." The older woman's smile softened her aristocratic features. "Silas faced the same doubt when I first suggested documenting his techniques for the Smithsonian Archive. He didn't believe anyone would be interested in what he called just old-fashioned woodworking." She paused, her gaze intent. "But authenticity matters more than expertise at this stage. You're learning the tradition the way it was always meant to be, passed down through direct transmission from one generation to the next. That story, that process, is as valuable as the finished products themselves." Brennan had been listening from the doorway, absorbing the adult conversation with his characteristic intensity. He stepped forward, one of his small carvings clutched in his hand. "Would people really want to learn how to make things like this?" His voice balanced between hope and skepticism, the wariness of a child who had learned not to trust promises too easily. Vivian accepted the carving, a small owl with remarkably expressive eyes, despite its simple form, and examined it with the same serious attention she might give a museum piece. "Young man, this is exactly what people are hungry for. In a world where everything is mass-produced and disposable, objects made by human hands with care and attention have special power. They remind us that we're capable of creating, not just consuming." Theodore outlined the practical aspects of their proposal with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. The first step would be establishing legal protections through conservation easements that would prevent future development while allowing educational activities. Next would come applications for historic designation of the workshop and cabin, followed by foundation grants to fund restoration and program development. The process would take months, but with Vivian's connections and Theodore's legal expertise, They believed they could expedite matters significantly. More importantly, they could provide immediate support through a planning grant from the Appalachian Cultural Heritage Foundation, enough to cover basic living expenses while the larger funding was secured. The offer felt too good to be true, and Lorelei's corporate wariness still functioned enough to ask the crucial question. "What's the catch?" Vivian exchanged a glance with her grandson, and something unspoken passed between them. "The catch, my dear, is that Garrett Blackwell and his allies won't give up easily. Once they realize what you're planning, they'll fight it with everything they have. Luxury vacation developments are enormously profitable, and the water rights alone would be worth millions to the right buyers." Theodore's expression grew grave, his lawyer's mind already anticipating the battles ahead. "They'll use every legal and political tool available. Zoning challenges, environmental impact claims, historical documentation requirements. And those are just the official channels. In communities like this, there can be unofficial pressure as well." The implied threat hung in the air, but Lorelei had already faced Crane's selective enforcement and Blackwell's thinly veiled warnings. She knew the fight would be brutal, personal, with stakes that went beyond property lines and building codes. But she also knew with a certainty that surprised her that she was ready for it. The weeks of struggling with hand tools, of learning to listen to wood and understand what it wanted to become, had taught her something fundamental about patience and persistence that her corporate career never had. Some battles were not won through aggressive negotiation or strategic maneuvering. They were won through stubborn refusal to surrender, through commitment to something larger than immediate profit, through the simple act of showing up every day and doing the work. It was the second week of August when the storm arrived with a fury that seemed biblical in its intensity. The skies darkened early that Thursday afternoon, drawing Lorelei, Brennan, Dalton, and Everett back to the cottage just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. Within minutes, the gentle shower transformed into a raging downpour wind, driving water sideways against the windows. Lightning fractured the sky, followed immediately by thunder that shook the small building's foundation. Brennan pressed against her side, his earlier bravado dissolving with each thunderclap. "Will the cabin be okay? Rain might get into the workshop." The same fear had seized her heart. The cabin's roof, though partially repaired, still had vulnerable sections. If water penetrated the workshop's ceiling, the irreplaceable contents could be damaged beyond recovery. Silas's tools, the samples, the unfinished projects, 4 generations of accumulated knowledge, all at risk. Dalton's expression mirrored her concern. "That western section we haven't patched yet. Could be taking on water. I'd better check on it." Brennan's fingers dug into her sleeve, panic evident in his wide eyes. "No, it's dangerous out there." The boy's fear was justified. The storm had reached frightening intensity, the kind of weather that killed people who took unnecessary risks. But the thought of water damaging the workshop, destroying what Silas had protected for so long, overrode her caution. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'll go with Dalton. Everett can stay here with you." The drive to the cabin took 3 times longer than normal, the truck creeping through sheets of rain that reduced visibility to mere feet. When they finally arrived, her worst fears materialized. Water cascaded through a section of the roof, pouring directly into the main room where the hidden workshop entrance was located. They worked with frantic intensity, positioning buckets under the worst leaks, stringing tarps to channel water away from vulnerable areas, mopping the spreading puddles before they reached the workshop's concealed entrance. Dalton moved with the focused efficiency of someone battling a living enemy, his movements deliberate despite the emergency. When the immediate crisis subsided, Lorelei unlocked the workshop to check for damage. To her immense relief, the hidden room remained dry, protected by the cabin's sturdy original construction that Silas had built to last. The tools hung undisturbed on their pegs, the wood samples safe in their careful arrangements. Dalton surveyed the space with renewed appreciation. "Your grandfather built this section right, even if he let the rest go. See how he angled the ceiling joists. Water would have to defy gravity to get in here." As the storm gradually diminished from apocalyptic to merely severe, they settled on the workshop stools, waiting for conditions to improve enough for the drive back. Water dripped rhythmically into strategically placed buckets, creating an oddly meditative soundtrack. The companionable silence stretched between them until Dalton broke it with a question that felt carefully chosen. "Been meaning to ask you something. How serious are you about staying up here?" Lorelei hesitated, the question crystallizing doubts she had been avoiding. "I want to. I really do. But practically speaking, Brennan needs school. I need income. And Crane's permit requirements would drain my savings before the cabin could pass inspection." Dalton nodded, unsurprised by her assessment. "Local politics makes things complicated. Crane's been in Blackwell's pocket for years. Any property Blackwell wants, Crane finds a way to squeeze the owner with code violations and permit delays until they're ready to sell for whatever they can get." The implied corruption sparked her corporate-honed sense of injustice. "That can't be legal." His weathered hands traced idle patterns on the workbench, the gesture of someone choosing words carefully. "Maybe not. But proving it would take deeper pockets than most folks around here have." He paused, then added something that felt significant. "Your grandfather was different, though. Had resources most people didn't know about. Fought them to a standstill more than once." The comment aligned with everything she had been discovering, but she wanted confirmation. "What do you mean, resources?" Dalton's expression grew guarded, as if he had said more than intended. "Not my story to tell. Just saying Silas had ways of pushing back that surprised people. Ways you might want to look into, given what you're up against." The drive back to the cottage revealed the storm's impact on the mountain community. Downed trees blocked secondary roads, power lines sagged under broken branches. Several older structures showed significant damage, roofs, partially torn away porches, collapsed under the wind's assault. At the cottage, Brennan launched himself at her relief, palpable in the fierce hug he delivered. "The workshop okay? Did the roof hold?" His concern for the workshop rather than the cabin itself confirmed his growing attachment to what they were building, to the legacy they were learning to carry forward. That night, Lorelei could not sleep. The storm had exposed the precariousness of everything she was attempting. Without substantial funds for renovation, Crane would never approve occupancy permits. Without permanent housing, Brennan could not enroll in local schools. Without income, their remaining savings would evaporate within weeks. The morning brought a discovery that transformed precariousness into crisis. She arrived at the cabin to find the renovation work Dalton had completed partially destroyed. Newly replaced porch boards had been pried up. A section of repaired roof had been damaged, creating new leaks that the storm had not caused. Most disturbingly, someone had attempted to break into the workshop. The lock showed scratch marks from amateur lock-picking attempts, evidence of someone who knew what they were looking for but lacked the skill to access it cleanly. Dalton surveyed the damage with tight-lipped anger, his usual calm replaced by something harder. This wasn't random vandalism. Someone knew exactly what they were targeting. Someone sending you a message. The violation felt personal in ways that corporate battles never had. Her sanctuary defiled by malicious intent, the place where she had begun to rebuild not just a cabin, but an entire life deliberately damaged to intimidate her into retreat. But beneath the shock and anger, a steelier emotion emerged, determination crystallized by threat. Whoever had done this had miscalculated badly. Rather than frightening her into submission, they had eliminated any lingering doubts about her course of action. The corporate executive who had arrived, broken and directionless, had transformed into something Blackwell and Crane had not anticipated: a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. She stood among the destruction, Brennan's hand in hers, and felt the weight of 4 generations settling onto her shoulders. The Ashfords had survived economic depressions, cultural shifts that made their work obsolete, and decades of being dismissed as irrelevant anachronisms. They would survive this too, not by running, not by surrendering to pressure, but by doing what they had always done, building something beautiful and lasting from whatever materials were at hand, trusting that quality and persistence would eventually triumph over expedience and greed. The traditions stretched back through generations, demanding to be carried forward, and Lorelei Ashford, despite every rational reason to give up, understood that this was her inheritance to protect. The sheriff's deputy who took her statement about the vandalism showed visible discomfort when Blackwell's name arose in tangential conversation. He promised to increase patrols in the area, but his tone carried the resignation of someone who knew the investigation would lead nowhere. Lorelei spent the following morning in Cedar Creek, assembling her coalition with renewed urgency. The farmers downstream listened with growing alarm as she explained Blackwell's plans for the watershed. The trout fishing guides understood immediately what damming the creek would mean for their livelihoods. The owner of the small hydroelectric installation saw his entire business evaporating if water flow patterns changed. By noon, she had commitments from 12 businesses and landowners, people who recognized that the Ashford property stood as the final barrier between their traditional way of life and the luxury development juggernaut that Blackwell represented. The black SUV appeared at the cottage that afternoon, arriving with the inevitability of a storm system she had watched building on the horizon. Blackwell emerged without the veneer of professional courtesy that had masked their earlier encounter. His voice carried the cold certainty of someone unaccustomed to opposition, each word measured for maximum impact. "This property is going to be developed, Ms. Ashford. The only question is whether you benefit financially from the inevitable or waste resources fighting market forces you can't control." He let the silence stretch, then delivered what he clearly considered a final offer. $3.5 million, all cash. The offer expires at the end of this week. Lorelei met his gaze without flinching, corporate negotiation training asserting itself even as her hands trembled with suppressed anger. "Mr. Blackwell, this property has been in my family for 4 generations. It's not for sale at any price." His expression hardened, calculation replacing persuasion in his eyes. The shift was subtle but unmistakable, like watching a predator decide whether to continue stalking or strike directly. When he glanced toward Brennan, who watched warily from the cottage doorway, his voice took on an edge that made her blood run cold. "Everyone has a price, Ms. Ashford. Even your grandfather understood that eventually." He paused, his attention still fixed on her son. "Raising a child alone is expensive. Private schools, college funds, medical emergencies. Lots of unexpected costs along the way." The implied threat leveraging her maternal concerns ignited something primal in Lorelei's response. This man had just crossed a line that even corporate warfare had never approached, using her child as a pressure point in his development scheme. Her voice emerged flat, stripped of emotion but carrying absolute finality. "You should leave now, Mr. Blackwell. Any further communication can go through my attorney." His smile tightened, the mask slipping enough to reveal genuine anger beneath the polished exterior. "The county inspectors around here can be real sticklers, Ms. Ashford. Trying to renovate without the right permits can turn into a legal nightmare, just something to consider." As the SUV disappeared down the mountain road, Lorelei realized the confrontation had crossed a critical threshold. What had begun as bureaucratic harassment and financial pressure had escalated to personal intimidation. The stakes were no longer just property and permits. They involved her family's safety and future. That evening she called an emergency strategy session at the cottage, assembling Dalton, Everett, Vivian, and Theodore around the small kitchen table. The gravity of the situation was clear to everyone present. Theodore spread legal documents across the table, his lawyer's mind already working through contingencies. "We need more time. The historical documentation is moving forward, but we're at least 3 weeks from preliminary approval. Once that's in process, they can't touch anything with potential historical significance without state-level review." Vivian, typically unflappable, showed rare agitation in the way her fingers drummed against the tabletop. "Could we delay the inspection? Medical emergency scheduling conflict?" Dalton's response carried the weight of someone who knew bureaucratic warfare from the inside. "They'll just reschedule. And if we refuse outright, Crane will get a court order. He's been setting this trap for weeks." Lorelei had been silent, mentally reviewing the cabin's layout, considering and discarding various strategies. A memory surfaced from childhood, Silas showing her a magic trick when she was 9, then explaining the principle behind it with a craftsman's precision. The words came back to her now, as clear as if he were speaking them in the room. "Don't hide what you don't want them to see, Lorelei girl. Give them something more interesting to look at. Misdirection works better than concealment every time." Her voice cut through the anxious planning. What if we don't try to prevent the inspection? What if we make it work for us instead? The strategy was audacious, perhaps foolhardy, but the alternatives were worse. Rather than attempting to conceal the workshop, which would inevitably raise suspicions if inspectors noticed the discrepancy between interior and exterior dimensions, they would create a diversion. Dalton would discover structural damage in another part of the cabin, damage significant enough to demand immediate attention from the inspection team. Meanwhile, they would deliberately create a small, easily discoverable hidden compartment in a different location containing just enough interesting historical material to satisfy curiosity without revealing the actual workshop. The false discovery would fulfill the inspector's expectations of finding something concealed, directing attention away from the real secret while providing exactly the kind of historical significance that would support their preservation claims. Theodore's lawyer instincts made him cautious. It's risky. If they're not satisfied with the decoy, if they keep searching, Lorelei weighed the alternatives and found them all worse than taking this calculated gamble. Sometimes the only path forward is through the fire. We can't hide forever and we can't outrun them, but we can be smarter than they expect. She turned to Vivian, seeing in the older woman's eyes the same steely determination that had sustained generations of activists and reformers. Can you accelerate the historical documentation? Get at least preliminary protection in place before they have time to react. Vivian's aristocratic features hardened with resolve. I'll call in favors at the State Historical Society. We might be able to get emergency consideration based on imminent threat to significant cultural artifacts. They've done it before for endangered sites. The inspection was scheduled for the following Thursday, the third week of August, giving them exactly 3 days to prepare. They worked around the clock, implementing the deception, while simultaneously documenting the workshop's historical significance with frantic urgency. Vivian brought in a preservation specialist from the Smithsonian who photographed every tool and technique sample, creating the detailed record necessary for historical designation. The specialist's growing excitement as she examined Silas's work provided independent validation of what Lorelei already knew. This was not just family history, but cultural heritage that deserved protection. Meanwhile, Dalton created the diversionary structural damage with the skill of someone who understood buildings intimately. A section of floor near the kitchen now appeared to be collapsing into the crawl space below, looking alarming but entirely controlled and reversible once the inspection passed. Everett constructed the decoy hidden compartment behind a loose stone in the fireplace, deliberately more obvious than the real workshop entrance. Inside this false discovery point, they placed several genuinely historical items, early technique samples too damaged for practical use, photocopies of the oldest workshop records, and a few antique tools that had outlived their functionality. Enough to create excitement about historical significance without revealing the workshop's existence. Enough to make inspectors feel clever for finding what they were meant to find. Brennan contributed with unexpected insight, suggesting they leave obvious signs of recent activity in strategic areas: half-empty coffee cups, open books, scattered pencils. His 8-year-old understanding of adult behavior recognized that people investigated signs of recent human presence almost instinctively. The morning of the inspection arrived clear and cool, a perfect autumn day that belied the tension gripping everyone involved. Lorelei had barely slept, rehearsing responses to potential questions, visualizing pathways through the cabin that would keep inspectors away from the concealed entrance. Wallace Crane arrived with 3 other county officials, his expression carrying the triumphant anticipation of someone about to deliver a killing blow. But his smile faltered when he noticed the Smithsonian representative taking photographs of the cabin's exterior, documenting architectural features with professional equipment. Lorelei met him on the porch, her voice carrying professional courtesy that matched his own false pleasantness. "Mr. Crane, I see you brought quite the inspection team. We're cooperating fully with the State Historical Society's documentation process. Since you expressed such concern about the property's historical integrity, I thought you would appreciate their involvement." The subtle power shift was perceptible. Crane had expected a defensive homeowner trying to hide violations, not a confident property owner surrounded by institutional representatives who lent weight and legitimacy to her position. His momentary confusion provided the perfect opening for Dalton's dramatic discovery. A sharp crack from inside the cabin drew everyone's attention, the sound of stressed wood surrendering to pressure. Dalton emerged, his expression convincingly alarmed. "We've got a serious situation in here. Floors giving way near the back wall. Could be foundation subsidence." The inspection team immediately focused on this potential safety hazard, following him inside to examine the apparently failing floor section. Lorelei allowed herself one glance at Brennan, who gave her the subtlest thumbs up from his position near the cottage before disappearing from view. The next 2 hours unfolded according to their careful choreography. The inspectors documented the floor damage with professional thoroughness, then proceeded with their room-by-room examination. When they reached the fireplace, the strategically placed artifacts drew attention exactly as intended. One of the younger inspectors noticed the loose stone and, with an excitement that would have been comical under other circumstances, discovered the hidden compartment. The historical materials inside created precisely the reaction they had hoped for: professional interest from the Smithsonian representative, who immediately began explaining the artifact's significance to increasingly attentive county officials. Only Crane remained suspicious, his eyes constantly scanning for additional irregularities. When the inspection reached the eastern wall where the workshop entrance was concealed, Lorelei felt her heart rate accelerate. This was the moment of greatest risk. She deliberately engaged Crane in conversation about permit requirements for the floor repair, positioning herself between him and the critical bookshelf section. The Smithsonian representative simultaneously drew the other inspector's attention to architectural details on the opposite wall, creating a perfect division of focus that left the concealed entrance uninspected. The county official who arrived mid-inspection transformed everything. He was younger than Crane, with the earnest bearing of someone who took historic preservation seriously as public policy rather than bureaucratic obstacle. His announcement carried the weight of institutional authority that even Crane could not dismiss. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've been informed that the State Historical Society has granted this property preliminary protection status as a site of cultural significance. Any enforcement actions will need to be coordinated with state-level review to ensure historical elements are properly protected during renovation." Crane's frustration was evident beneath his professional veneer as the inspection concluded. The anticipated violations had failed to materialize in any significant form. The discovery of historical artifacts had shifted the narrative from code enforcement to preservation. Worst of all, from his perspective, the State Historical Society representative had announced protections that would limit the county's enforcement options dramatically. When the officials finally departed, Lorelei waited until their vehicles disappeared around the mountain curve before allowing herself to breathe normally again. The workshop remained undiscovered, protected by misdirection and careful planning. The historical documentation was proceeding faster than anticipated, and Crane had been outmaneuvered on the bureaucratic battlefield he thought he controlled. But victory came with immediate consequences. The following morning, Blackwell's black SUV appeared at the cottage, and this time there was no pretense of civility. His voice carried barely controlled fury, the polish stripped away to reveal the ruthless developer beneath. "This property is going to be developed, Ms. Ashford. I've invested too much to walk away now. There are other ways to get what I want." The threat was explicit enough that Lorelei felt the first real fear she had experienced since arriving on the mountain. This was no longer about permits and property values. This was about a powerful man who was used to winning and had just been publicly humiliated. She stood her ground, drawing on reserves of courage she had not known she possessed. "You know what the difference is between us, Mr. Blackwell? I'm building something that will still matter 100 years from now. You're just moving money from one account to another." The words emerged with absolute conviction, and she saw them land like physical blows. For perhaps the first time in his career, Garrett Blackwell had encountered someone who genuinely did not care about his wealth or his threats, someone operating from an entirely different value system than the one he understood. He retreated to his vehicle without another word, but the look he gave her promised that this was far from over. The following weeks brought revelations that transformed the landscape of their struggle entirely. The investigation into Wallace Crane uncovered extensive connections to Blackwell's development interests that went far beyond professional cooperation. Documents revealed that Crane had received financial incentives for selectively enforcing building codes against property owners who refused to sell to Blackwell's company. Email records showed systematic harassment targeting specific properties, including detailed instructions from Blackwell himself to make life impossible for stubborn holdouts. One email in particular, dated just days after Lorelei's arrival, spelled out the strategy with damning clarity. "The Ashford woman won't last through winter if we apply enough pressure. Red tag the cabin slow walk any permits, make sure she understands there's an easy way out and a hard way. She'll take the easy way eventually. They all do." As the corruption investigation expanded, more of Blackwell's questionable business practices came to light. Environmental violations at previous development sites, undocumented workers paid below minimum wage, tax irregularities involving offshore accounts that suggested money laundering. The collective weight of these discoveries effectively ended Crane's career in county government and severely damaged Blackwell's influence with the county commission and state regulatory agencies. But it did not end the threat entirely. Men like Blackwell did not surrender easily, did not accept defeat gracefully. They retreated, regrouped, and found new angles of attack. By early December, 4 months after the inspection, the momentum had shifted dramatically in Lorelei's favor, though not completely. The State Historical Society granted the Ashford Workshop official designation as a site of cultural significance. The Appalachian Cultural Heritage Foundation approved initial funding for educational programming, though the amount was less than originally hoped. The conservation easements that would permanently protect the property's watershed were in their final review stage, which meant legal challenges could still derail them. Most significantly, the County Commission scheduled a public hearing on Blackwell's development proposal for mid-December. The vote would determine whether his luxury resort plans could proceed or whether the Ashford property's alternative vision would receive official support that would make it untouchable going forward. The session had been strategically scheduled for a Tuesday morning when working people would struggle to attend, but Lorelei's coalition had anticipated this maneuver. Farmers rearranged harvesting schedules. Shop owners posted signs announcing temporary closure for community business. Retirees organized carpools to ensure everyone who wanted to attend could do so. By meeting time, the county courthouse overflowed with Cedar Creek residents, most wearing blue ribbons symbolizing watershed protection. Blackwell's supporters, primarily business interests from outside the immediate community, found themselves significantly outnumbered. The technical presentations proceeded with bureaucratic efficiency. Blackwell's development team displayed architectural renderings that made the resort look like a natural extension of the mountain landscape, economic projections that promised jobs and tax revenue, environmental assessments that downplayed the watershed impact. Lorelei's coalition countered with their own studies, detailed analysis of how damming the creek would affect downstream agriculture, testimony from hydrologists about the aquifer's fragility, documentation of the workshop's historical significance. The commissioners listened with carefully neutral expressions, their faces revealing little about their inclinations. Years of political experience had taught them to betray nothing until votes were counted. When public comment began, Blackwell's strategy became clear. A succession of speakers emphasized economic benefits, property tax increases, and modernization opportunities, subtly characterizing opposition as backward-looking sentimentality that sacrificed progress for nostalgia. Lorelei had anticipated this framing and prepared accordingly. When her turn came, she approached the podium carrying the completed jewelry box, the piece Silas had left unfinished, that she had spent 3 months learning to complete properly. She placed it before the commissioners, and the craftsmanship immediately drew their attention. Even in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the government building, the inlay work seemed to glow with inner life. Her voice carried this conviction of someone who had discovered what truly mattered after spending years chasing the wrong things. Progress isn't just measured in dollars or development. Real progress preserves what's valuable while building what's needed. She outlined the educational center vision with the same precision she had once brought to corporate presentations, but this time the numbers represented something beyond quarterly profits: job creation through traditional craft training, sustainable tourism that enhanced rather than replaced existing industries, watershed protection that would benefit agricultural interests throughout the county. But her most powerful argument came when she opened the jewelry box, demonstrating the hidden compartments and intricate mechanisms that represented generations of accumulated knowledge and skill. The wood whispered against her fingertips as she revealed each secret. This wasn't created on an assembly line or mass-produced overseas. It was made by human hands using techniques that connect us directly to our ancestors. She gestured toward Brennan, who sat proudly in the front row, and felt her voice catch slightly with emotion she had not anticipated. And to our children who deserve to inherit both economic opportunity and cultural heritage, who deserve to know that creating something beautiful and lasting is just as valuable as any stock portfolio or development deal. The commissioner's questions revealed growing interest in the alternative vision. They asked specific inquiries about educational programming, job creation, potential, and conservation easement details that suggested they were seriously considering approval rather than merely going through required motions. Blackwell's representatives appeared increasingly uncomfortable as the conversation shifted from development benefits to preservation values, as commissioners who had seemed reliably pro-business began questioning the wisdom of sacrificing irreplaceable resources for projects that could be built anywhere. The meeting's turning point arrived unexpectedly. As Crane rose to speak, presumably to emphasize regulatory concerns about the Ashford property, the county sheriff intercepted him. The conversation was brief, quiet, but the effect was dramatic. Crane's expression transformed from smugness to shock to visible alarm in the space of seconds. Without addressing the commission, he was escorted from the chamber through a side door, leaving confused murmuring in his wake. The sheriff returned and approached the commission chairman, delivering a statement that was then repeated for the assembly with clinical precision. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've been informed that Mr. Crane has been temporarily relieved of his duties pending investigation of certain regulatory improprieties. Today's scheduled testimony from the planning department will be postponed." The clinical language could not disguise the bombshell implication. Crane's corruption had been exposed at the worst possible moment for Blackwell's proposal, potentially undermining the entire regulatory strategy that had been designed to pressure Lorelei into selling. The remaining presentations proceeded in an atmosphere of palpable shift. Commissioners asked increasingly skeptical questions of the development team while showing visible interest in the educational center concept. The vote, when it finally came, postponed decision on Blackwell's proposal while requesting more detailed information on the Ashford Workshop Educational Center. It was not final victory, but it represented decisive momentum in the right direction. The commissioner's request for detailed programming plans indicated serious consideration rather than perfunctory rejection. Blackwell cornered her in the courthouse hallway afterward, and for the first time, she saw genuine rage beneath the polished exterior. "This isn't over, Ashford. You've won a skirmish, not the war. I don't walk away from investments this large." His voice dropped to a threatening whisper that made her glad they were in a public space. "There are always other approaches, other ways to get what I want when the official channels fail." She met his gaze without flinching, a calm certainty replacing the defensive anxiety that had characterized their earlier encounters. This man had threatened her child, vandalized her property, corrupted public officials, and tried to steal land that had supported 4 generations of her family. And he had lost. Not completely. Not permanently, perhaps, but decisively enough that everyone in Cedar Creek now knew the battle lines and understood what was really at stake. The December afternoon had turned cold, the mountain winter beginning to assert itself. Lorelei walked out of the courthouse into pale sunshine, where her coalition waited, their blue ribbons bright against winter coats. Dalton stood with Everett, both men wearing expressions of cautious satisfaction. Vivian and Theodore consulted quietly near their vehicle, already planning next steps. A dozen farmers and business owners clustered in small groups, discussing what they had witnessed. Brennan broke away from where he had been talking with some of the other children and ran to her side. His hand found hers with the automatic gesture of 8-year-old trust, and she felt the weight of what she was building settle more firmly onto her shoulders. This was not a perfect ending. The commissioners had postponed rather than rejected Blackwell's proposal. The conservation easement still required final approval. Foundation funding remained uncertain. The cabin renovation was months from completion, and winter was coming. But standing in that courthouse parking lot surrounded by people who had chosen to fight alongside her, Lorelei understood something fundamental that her corporate career had never taught her. Victory was not measured in quarterly reports or stock prices. It was measured in relationships, built traditions, preserved communities, strengthened. In the simple but profound act of creating something meant to last beyond your own lifetime. Brennan squeezed her hand, looking up at her with an expression that mixed childhood innocence with hard-won wisdom. "We did it, didn't we, Mom? We made them listen." She smiled, pulling him close. "We made them listen. But the real work is just beginning." Together they walked toward the truck where Dalton and Everett waited, ready to drive back up the mountain to the cabin that was slowly becoming home to the workshop that held 4 generations of knowledge waiting to be shared. The path forward would remain difficult. Blackwell would not surrender easily. Money and influence could find new channels of pressure, new ways to attack what they were building. Winter would test the cabin's repairs and their resolve. But the Ashfords had made their choice, and Cedar Creek had witnessed it. They would build, teach, preserve, and pass forward what they had been given, trusting that quality and persistence mattered more than quarterly profits and development schemes. In a world that increasingly forgot how to wait for anything worth having, that simple act of preservation and transmission felt like the most important work she could possibly do. The workshop waited on the mountain, patient and protected. The tools hung ready on their pegs. The traditions stretched back through generations, demanding to be carried forward. And Lorelei Ashford walked into the winter afternoon knowing that some battles were worth fighting. Not because victory was assured, but because the act of fighting preserved something essential about who we are and what we value. The mountains would endure. The craft would survive. And 4 generations of Ashfords would not have struggled and sacrificed for nothing. That certainty was enough to carry her through whatever came next.